Good afternoon. My name is Anthony Miller. I'm a senior religion and philosophy major here at Morehouse College. We are here today with Mr. Lonnie King in the Leadership Center, this great trailblazer in the American movement for civil rights. Mr. King, my first question is concerning your beginnings. So where you're from and what initiated your drive to be an activist?
Well, let me begin by saying that I reject the notion of icon. I guess it must mean you've gotten old, and therefore you start getting that kind of a moniker. But I may have gotten old chronologically, but I'm still very young in my mind. So I'm not sure I'm ready to become an icon yet. But having said that, I was born in a little town called Arlington, Georgia, which is 27 miles southwest of Albany, Georgia. It's in that area of Georgia that's, I always say, is really behind the cotton curtain, primarily because agriculture, and especially cotton and peanuts, corn, those agricultural products were the lifeblood of that particular area. I was also born in 1936 at a time when the entire country, maybe even the world, was in this Great Depression. And whereas I did not feel it because I was a baby at the time, my grandparents, who really reared me from the time I was 2 until I was 8, certainly told me about how bad it was during the Depression. And I guess they survived because, number one, he was a preacher, a Baptist preacher. His name was Reverend Joseph P. Smith. And my grandmother's name was Mrs. Dicey Smith. They had a farm, and so it was somewhat self-sufficient. You know, we had the chickens there, the hogs, and the gardens, and what have you. So I guess that was a part of what made it palatable or more comfortable for them to go through the Great Depression. The environment that I was born in, besides the agricultural part, was one wherein slavery, to a great extent, was still in vogue. And when I say slavery, I don't mean in chains per se, but you had a situation in southwest Georgia and in almost all the rural towns of Georgia, including Atlanta, come to think of it, wherein black people had no rights that the youngest white person was bound to respect. It was an area wherein blacks came to town only on Saturdays to get their groceries, get their victuals to take back on a wagon back to their farms. When I was a child, I saw grown black men have to stand aside in order to let a young white boy pass by unfettered on the sidewalk. So it was a very, very vicious system. And as I reflect on that system now, having studied more about history, it's very clear to me that the North deserted the South, or should I say deserted the African Americans after slavery. And they basically allowed the people who perpetuated slavery to do it under another name called segregation. And they practiced it through discrimination. And they didn't have any conscience at all about having this duality here. You know, preaching to the world that this is a land of opportunity, hope, what have you, except for people from Africa. It was only for people who were from Western Europe. The rest of the folks, you need not apply for anything called freedom. In my early years, I also developed a deep sense of telling the truth. And let me add a little jocular to this. My granddaddy used to always say, I don't care how bad it is, tell the truth about what happened. Don't lie about something. So one day, my granddad and I were one Saturday, going to town to get some groceries and some other supplies to come back home. And we passed by this lady's house, and she didn't hear us until we had gotten by the house. You know, wagons make noise, especially empty wagon. I guess we gotten about 100 yards beyond her house, and she came out and started screaming, Reverend Smith, Reverend Smith. I said, Granddaddy, she's calling you. He says, I don't want to be bothered with her today. I don't want to stop to shop for her today. And he just kept on going. On the way back, a couple of hours later, the lady heard the wagon coming, so she got outside and stood with her hands on her hips, and she said, Reverend Smith, did you hear me call you? I wanted you to bring me some groceries back. My granddaddy put on his best Pepsodent smile and said, Miss whatever her name was, I didn't see you. I didn't hear you. And I said, Granddaddy, yes, you did, because I told you. He hit me and knocked me off the wagon down on the ground. What I learned from that is that tell the truth, but sometimes with discretion. Another time that my granddad and I, he did something that I was asked about. My grandmother one day asked me, have you seen Reverend Smith? Now, she never called him Joseph Smith. She never called him my husband. She called him Reverend Smith. I guess it was a sign of respect during that time. Have you seen Reverend Smith? Because I had just come in from school, and I said, yes, I have. She said, well, where is he? I said, well, I saw his wagon in front of Miss Eddie Knox's house as I left school. She said, oh, okay. Well, what I did not know at the time was that my granddaddy was dating Miss Eddie Knox. And my grandmother was running a little train on him, to try to find out where was he. I didn't get a beating for that one. I think she took care of me on that one. But the point is, all of my, I guess you would say, I have all kinds of relatives, cousins. One thing that was a common denominator, if you're doing something bad, don't let him see it. Because if he sees it and they ask him about it, he's going to tell him the truth. That kind of upbringing, I think, had a lot to do with who I am today. I remember also that Eugene Talmadge was running for governor there around 41, 42 in that neighborhood. You may not know a lot about him, but he was one of the most racist governors the state has ever known, and he came into power through the county unit system. The first time I saw an airplane, it was a crop duster, and he was dropping leaflets from that plane, or should I say his people were, all over the little country town down there. And so I picked up one, because by this time I could read. Folks had taught me how to read. And it was nigger, 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 nigger this, nigger that. And I had never actually seen that word or heard it before. And so I went home and I asked my granddad, I said, Granddaddy, what's a nigger? And so he then sat me down and tried to explain who this guy was, and to the extent that he could explain the racial situation and how bad it was. And one thing I remember him telling me that he was recruiting 50-cent memberships for the NAACP. I said, well, what's the NAACP? He said, that's the National Association for Advancement of Colored People. And young man, son, that organization one day is going to set us free, because we're still in slavery. The only difference is that we can go home at night. So those kind of things that were said to me, that I saw, had a lot to do with my feelings about matters today. I don't hold any bitterness toward Western Europeans. It's just that I believe that they are not honest when they try to say that they have not created over centuries the kind of conditions that our young black men find themselves in today. And I can go on and I can develop that for you. I left Arlington, Georgia when I was 8, and came here and joined Ebenezer Baptist Church, which is where my mother was going. And I got baptized the following week, and baptized by Martin King's daddy. And I was a person who was very active in the church once I got in there. I formed something called the Ebenezer Youth Organization that was designed to bring the youth together in the church to put youth programs together. And I did that until I left there to go to the Navy later on. But let me just put a pin right there, because there may be some other questions that you may want to ask me about an earlier period that I have described that I did not cover.
Yes, you spoke of your conversations you had with your grandfather with regard to Eugene Talmadge and the NAACP.
Yes.
What age, if you can recall, you told us the age
6.
6. That was the age.
1942.
Okay. That was the age you were made aware of what the problem was.
I had never seen the word nigger before.
Right.
And
right.
I saw it in writing,
Right.
dropped from a plane.
So that's the age that you were made aware of the problem. What age, if you could recall, that you felt it within yourself to solve the problem of which you were made aware years earlier?
Well, something happened to me when I was 13, after I'd come to Atlanta, that stands out. I was a champion table tennis player in Atlanta, and I played at John Hope School a lot up on Boulevard.
Mm-hmm.
So this one evening I was coming through there, and there was a field behind John Hope that was called the White Gas Field, and what they meant by that was not white because of people, but white because White Motor Company owned the field, and they used to park their trucks there, and they had a little warehouse out there. So I was going through that field this day, as I had done many days before, but by this time the night watchman had hired him a dog, got him a dog. So the dog ran out to me and tried to bite me. And so I kicked at the dog. The big night watchman hollered, "Nigga, don't you kick my dog. You stand right there, don't you move." And of course, during those days, if a white man said, "Don't you move," you don't move because he might shoot you if you do move, okay? Mm-hmm. So I stood there, he came over and he slapped me down, flat to the ground, and "Don't you be kicking at my dog." Well, that thing I've never forgotten. The statute of limitations has run now. I'll tell you what I did. I went on down to the YMCA, and after it got dark, I came back and got me a bunch of rocks, and I broke every window in that warehouse, every window. Mm-hmm. And that wasn't too nonviolent, but I couldn't figure out anything else I could do to show my resentment for having been put upon by this man because I almost kicked his dog. But let me just say this to you. To a great extent, I've always been kind of like a shy person. I don't go out trying to get in anybody's way. But one thing I did learn in my early days is that if you don't speak up for yourself, nobody else will. And if something is wrong, you have a moral obligation to try to right it. And that doesn't mean you can right all the wrongs, but you want to go to your master and say, at Judgment Day, I did the best that I could while it was my time to run this relay. Now, to more specifically answer your question about me, when I went into the Navy in 5 days before I was 18 to make money in order to go back to Morehouse, I signed up for a kiddie cruise. That's, you go in before you're 18 and you get out the day before you're 21. My mother, $5 a day in coffee I made, took me down there because I wasn't 18 to sign me up, and she told the recruiting officer, "My son cannot become a seagoing busboy." Now, I didn't know what she was talking about. What she meant was that if you're going to make him a waiter, waiting on white men, and in the steward's mate branch, then I'm going to revoke my signature. So in my service record, you see where I was promised that I was not going to be a steward's mate. And my mother said that if my son tells me that he's been made a steward's mate, then I'm going to get him out because he can wait on tables and wait on white people in town. He didn't have to go to sea to do that. So when I got to boot camp, I took a test, and I ended up having the highest test of all the 80-some people who were in my class. It was called a general classification test. And the person who gets the highest grade normally becomes the education petty officer with the responsibility for teaching the other 80-some young fellows naval law, naval rules to try to get them through boot camp. In other words, you're a tutor. And so I tutored the folks. there were about 4 or 5 blacks in that class, because the Navy primarily, and still is, primarily a white organization. But I ended up being one of the most popular persons in my group, because I was a champion table tennis player, and there was a tournament every Saturday. And I won all the tournaments while I was there for those 11 weeks. And the prize was 2 cartons of cigarettes. Well, I didn't smoke. And so all of my guys would come to see me win, because they would know that I'd give them the cigarettes. So I became a very popular person. When boot camp was over, I was coming back on the train, and we came through Cincinnati. There were about 4 or 5 white guys and me playing, having a good time. As we got ready to go across from Cincinnati into Kentucky, the white conductor came to me and said, "You got to move to the front of the train." And so one of the white guys said, "Why does he have to do that?" Well, coloreds have to sit in the front when we cross this bridge here, that river. And so the white guy said, "Well, if he's got to go up there, we're going to go up there. We're going to all go up there together." And so the conductor said, "Oh, hell." He just walked off. After I served my 30 days at home, came home for 30 days, I was sent back with about 30 people. I was in charge of them, to take them to our ship, the USS Oriskany, that was supposed to be in Alameda, California. And we chased the ship from Alameda down to San Diego, down to Long Beach, back to Alameda. We didn't have the kind of communications that we have today. We finally caught it in Alameda. So when I took the 30 records of the young men, plus mine, and presented them to the officer of the day, saluted him, they sent us down to something called the X1 division. That's the indoctrination division, for 2 weeks. At the end of that time, they then gave us a billet. They then gave us a job. And they gave out air controlman, fire controlman, personnelist, electronic technician. All these beautiful things were being given out. But there were 2 jobs going to the deck force. And the deck force was a job wherein you scrape paint, you chip paint, and you paint it. Mm-hmm. I was one person assigned, and the other person who had the lowest GCT, a white guy named Lamb from Tennessee, he was assigned. Both of us were assigned to the deck force. I had the highest GCT, he had the lowest, and because I had all the records. But we got assigned to the deck force to chip paint. Now, my mother wanted me to not go into the steward's mate thing, but they sent me to the deck force, which is a tad up from being a steward's mate. Well, I went down there and I chipped paint. About 200 people in my division at that time. All of a sudden one day, my division officer calls me over there and he says, "We want you to go up and start cleaning the head." Now, the head is the restroom, okay? Now, cleaning a restroom for 200 men is not a crystal stair. And I took the position, why am I being picked for this job? Well, I was the only black person in the whole group, so that's why I got picked. So I went up there and I said, this is racism to its core. But I remember something Benjamin Mays said when I was a freshman in Morehouse before I went in the Navy. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, if you are going to be a doctor out of Morehouse, be the best doctor that God has ever made. And he talked about lawyers, dentists, that. He said, but if fate befalls you and you happen to become a garbage man, be the very best garbage man that has ever come down the pike. And I thought about that. I said, this is not a lawyer, this is not a doctor, but this is garbage. So what I did was this. I ordered the supplies. I got paint, polished everything, and I repainted the whole place, polished it up, and then I was able to only work a half hour in the morning, a half hour in the afternoon, because the person who had responsibility for cleaning the head had no other responsibility, just clean the head. So I turned it into a beautiful job, and so what I could do then is read the rest of the time while I was there. Well, after I turned the job into a beautiful job in terms of the work, a third-class petty officer who was higher than me, white guy, put in a request to bump me from cleaning the head because I had turned it into a gravy job. Now, I'm very impressionable, and I'm listening, and I'm learning, and I'm catching on. And what I learned by that is simply this, is that even in a job that one would call an S job, if you turn it around and turn it into something that might be perfume, people will forget that you turned it into perfume. They will come and take it from you. And I saw that as the thing that really bothered me. There was something else that happened to me in the Navy. Because I started trying to go to dental technician school after they kicked me out of the head. And they wouldn't let me come until 1 year and 59 days were left on my tour, which would mean I had to sign up for another year, and I refused to do that. So one day, as fate would have it, I looked in the plan of the day. Now, the plan of the day is the calendar of events, schedule of events for the next day. And in there was a job for a dispersing clerk striker. And what that is that's a cashier, someone who counts the money and pays out the money on payday. So I went down there and applied for the job. All white, everybody's white now. I mean, it's really lily white in this place. So they looked at me like I was crazy. And so the lieutenant, the ensign, I'm sorry, Ensign Claren, J.C. Claren, said, I want to talk to you. He's in charge. He said, we won't bring you down here. I said, why not? He said, we don't want any Negroes down here. I said, wait a minute, my folks pay taxes just like your folks. Why is it that I can't come down here? I said, the military has been desegregated by President Truman, 1947. This is 1953. He said, everybody in here is from the South, and we don't want you down here. So you may as well not, we're not going to process your thing. I went to see the chaplain on the ship, the religious person, and I told him about what happened. His comment was, oh, they didn't say that, did they? I said, yes, they did. He just, that's all he did. I then went to see Lieutenant J.G. Horn, H-O-R-N-E, who is the division officer over these 200 people who were in the deck force. And I told him, I wasn't expecting much out of it, but I still told him what was going on. Horn said, come with me. He took me down there, and he came in and spoke to Claren, the ensign, and he said, Mr. King says, call me Mr. says, and he related what I had been told, what I had told him. Claren said, well, that's true. We don't want him down here. Horn said, I want his name in the plan of the day in the morning. And if it's not in the plan of the day in the morning, I'm going to see how you got your commission. And he said, come on, Mr. King, let's go. The next day, my name was in the plan of the day. And I was transferred down there into this lily white operation. They gave me hell down there. They wouldn't talk to me for 2 or 3 months. Finally, I'm just sitting there every day, just sitting there. Finally, a guy named Welty Wolf from Seattle, Washington, came up and said, you know, I can help you. He said, I went to dispersion school, so I know all this stuff. But I'm just in here for a log. I'm not in here to make any grade. I'm having time, a good time. He said, if you're willing to learn, he said, I'll teach you. I said, what does it require? He said, you got to read these books for the next 2 or 3 months, and then take the test in January. So I stayed aboard ship, and I read these books, and this guy worked with me, and then another guy named John Bloom helped. But now the rest of the folks didn't talk to me, just these 2 guys. So about 5 of us took the exam in January, and I was the only one who passed to become a petty officer. The other 4 guys did not. All of a sudden now, I become a part of the leadership as opposed to one of the followers. And it's amazing what happens when you get in power and people have to come to you in order to get their leave and a whole lot of other stuff. It's a very leavening kind of thing. I'm mentioning all this because I learned, number one, there's vicious racism in this country. It is imbued in people's bones. But I also learned that all people who are white are not necessarily racist. Because were it not for the guy named Lieutenant J.G. Horn, I never would have gotten into the dispersing thing. You follow me?
Yes, sir.
Now, before I got out, I made staff, you know, DK5 and all that kind of stuff. But these things happened when I was less than 21. So therefore, they had a very indelible imprint on me. And I think when you boil it all down, I came back to Atlanta, Georgia, because I wanted to be a part of this change down here, because I knew it was going to come. I told my friend Everett Render, who was in the Navy with me, that I was coming back to Atlanta and to Morehouse, because I felt that at some point we were going to have to get this yoke of segregation off our back, because I didn't think white folks were going to ever do it voluntarily. We're going to have to take it. They're not going to give it to you. You have to take it. And that means then that somebody is going to get killed, somebody's going to get hurt, someone is going to be mistreated. But what you have to do is recognize that if you happen to be a person of color anywhere in the world, not just the United States, you've got to be a part of a relay that's constantly trying to bring about this umbrella of freedom to include people who look like you, who came from Africa. That's the way the Western Europeans have set it up, and that's the way we have to keep fighting it. And that means that we got to make sure that we leave some time bombs here when we leave that will go off, and people like young folks like you will take this baton. And remember, these folks who are in power would not give up anything without a struggle. You got to agitate. And don't worry about whether or not you're liked. Black folks who are very well liked in most instances are not worth a darn. You have to be prepared to take a stand on something based on principle, based on truth. And a lot of folks don't want to deal with truth. They'd rather not deal with the truth. They want to deal with the fiction.
Which leads me to my next question. You mentioned Dr. Mays, and you mentioned your brief time at Morehouse before you went to the Navy. And your last statement you made, you were speaking about people being well-liked, and those who are being well-liked are usually not worth a darn. Dr. Mays said something that I found very, very profound. He said that I would rather fall into hell on purpose than to stumble into heaven following the crowd. And I want to know, at what point did you know that you were selected to not follow the crowd, all right? Or let me make this two questions, trying to merge it into one. What sparked your interest in Morehouse? What was it about Morehouse that was so attractive?
Well, I don't think I had any choice but to come to Morehouse, but to be honest with you. But let me just go back to the early days. I was living in the rear of 362 Capitol Avenue behind a fish market called Sewell's Fish Market, where Sewell did not move his rotten fish on a regular basis often. So we had fish odor in our nostrils all the time in that alley. The person who was throwing my newspaper every day, the Atlanta Journal, was a young man named Horace Ward, who lived in Summer Hill also, who is now a federal judge. When I came to town in 1945, my mother would not let me go to school in March when I came. She made me wait until September, because she said I was too far ahead. I was 2 grades ahead of myself. And she said, I don't want you to get 3 grades ahead of yourself, so you're going to sit here until September. So every day, Horace would come by, and we'd sit down and talk. And he was the first person to tell me about Morehouse College. I did not know that Daddy King had gone to Morehouse also until later. But Horace talked about what a great school it was, and that's where he was going, to college. I always felt I was going to go to college, but I did not know where I was going to go. Of course, getting more involved, more inculcated into what was happening at Ebenezer, you end up learning that there are two schools that the folks at Ebenezer who were in leadership pushed. One was Morehouse, the other one was Spelman. And so I pretty much knew I was going to go to Morehouse. The other thing that influenced me to come to Morehouse was my homeroom teacher, Mr. Marcus Beavers. Marcus J. Beavers. He went to Morehouse. He finished Morehouse in 1929. And so he was very instrumental in making sure that I stayed with my eyes on the mark. The other thing is this. I introduced Dr. Mays when I was a youngster at Ebenezer. And when I saw him, such a stately man, you just don't understand. I can't describe to you what it was like adequately to be in the presence of Benjamin E. Mays. His carriage, his conversation, all exuded, in my opinion, confidence, raising the bar. I used to say, I wonder if Dr. Mays ever takes off his shirt and tie just to go to bed. I mean, he was always on stage. I mean, and I think he understood that when he walked through the campus, there are those who were watching him just to see his gait. There was something about the man's carriage that impressed me when I first met him. And it fit into the scenario that I was already in, which was you going to Morehouse. We haven't had in the history of this college anyone before or since who can even tie Mays' bootstraps. There probably is another Mays coming, but he hadn't been here yet.
So I would presume that Mays was the most influential person in your life throughout your tenure at Morehouse.
Well, it was Mays at the top, but I cannot overlook the influence of E.B. Williams, who taught me economics. He was a tremendous, tremendous teacher. And in a kind of a convoluted way, I cannot dismiss Dean Brazil.
Okay.
Dean Brazil was, I guess you would say, a perfect #2 man for Mays. Because while Mays raised the money and kept the image up there, Brazil ran the school. And Brazil was the person who taught me that image is very important. And what I mean by that is this. I was an economics major. Brazil was an economics teacher. So he taught me about 3 classes. And I could never make anything on a final grade above a B-. I'd have an A average, but I'd get a B-. So finally when he did it to me for the second time, I said, Dean Brazil, how do you arrive at this kind of a grade? He says, young man, you hang on the corner too much. You hang on the corner too much. You can't be an A student hanging on the corner. I said, Dean Brazil, it ought to be based on what I put on that piece of paper, not where I play. No. Morehouse men don't stand on corners. Of course, that went down like a water on a duck's back on me at that time. But in reflecting on Brazil, I think I understand him better. But let me say something else to you. I'm probably one of, if you go and look at my transcript, I finished Morehouse with about 140 some hours, okay? It's supposed to be about 120, right?
Right, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Well, let me tell you about Dr. Brazil. While I was leading this movement, man, he chopped off about 20 of my hours because I wasn't making the classes. I was leading the movement. And I guess were it not for Mays, I would have been out of school. Because there were some people who tried to get me put out because they felt that I was on fire, too radical. Somebody was going to get killed. Daddy King said, you're going to wreck this town. I mean, how can you wreck a town that's already been wrecked with the segregation and discrimination, you know? And all I'm trying to do is to right the wrongs. But nevertheless, Brazil laid it to me. The standard was you go to class. And if you missed 3 classes, we began to take your hours. And so Brazil took my hours and made me have to keep taking classes. Well, I came back to Morehouse because I didn't finish in time. I ended up with ulcer, sick in Freedman's Hospital, a whole lot of stuff, you know. That was a price I had to pay for what I was doing. So I ran into Dr. Brazil, I'm sorry, in Washington, D.C. in 1968. I was I had been asked by Robert Kennedy to be the head of his Young Citizens for Kennedy when he was going to run for president. And so Brazil said to me, when are you going to come back to Morehouse and finish those 6 hours? I said, Dean Brazil, I'll come back next semester. And I did. I came back. And I finished in May of that next year, 69. He called me in. I was the last person that he signed off to graduate from Morehouse in his tenure, because he was retiring. And he said something to me that I still remember. He said, Mr. King, I owe you an apology. I said, what's that? He said, I was wrong in 1960 and you were right. If you knew Dean Brazil, that took a lot for him to say that. But a lot of people that we had as heroes at that time were on the wrong side of history. It wasn't because they were bad people. It's just that they had seen over the years our people beaten down every time they tried to stand up. They had seen 251 unsuccessful slave revolts. They had seen it. And so they had no way of knowing that this one in 1960 was going to be the only successful slave revolt in the Western Hemisphere outside of Haiti under Toussaint Louverture. They had no way of knowing that, because this man who ran Atlanta and who ran the South had no rules when it came to atrocities, mistreatment, you name it.
Mr. King, my name is Elijah Zehyoue, and I'm a senior history major from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I wanted to ask you, February 1st, 1960, what does that day mean for you and for the other students in the Atlanta University Center?
Well, first of all, let me just say that on the 1st of February, I didn't know what was going on. It was only on the 2nd of February that I realized that those 4 young boys had sat down at the Woolworths in Greensboro when it was reported in the newspaper. When I saw it happen, when I read it, something clicked in me that this is the time. And so there's a young man named Joseph Pierce, Joseph Nathaniel Melvin Henry Pierce, who was one of my best friends in high school as well as in college. And we were in the Navy together. I said, Joe, read this. And he read it. And I said, I think we ought to make this happen here. Those young folks up there in Greensboro shouldn't be doing this by themselves. I said, segregation is ubiquitous. It exists all over the South. So whether you're in Greensboro or Atlanta, if you are a black person or a Negro, you got to get back and go to a segregated whatever. He agreed with me. I then remembered, I looked around and I saw a young man that I'd met when I first came back from the Navy in 1957. We were in the line together to register. And during those days, it took you all day long to register. And so we're just standing there or sitting there for several hours. And you could tell your life story trying to register at Morehouse College during that time. Well, the young man that I met during that time was Julian Bond. And he told me all about his life. Dad was president of Fort Valley, and President Lincoln at one point, Dean of Education at AU. But most of all, he told me that he was a Time magazine young scholar in high school because of some essays that he had written. And I remembered that, and so I saw him there that day. And I felt that in order for this movement to really go, you got to have somebody who can put out the written word for you. In other words, you know, a movement cannot operate without having someone who can tell the story from your point of view, not somebody else's point of view, but from your point of view. And so I went over and I talked to Julian, and I talked, well, Joe Pierce and I talked to him about joining. He was laid back. He said, I asked him, had he seen the story? He says, yeah, I know about it. And I said, don't you think we ought to do something about it here? He said, well, somebody probably will. I said, let us make something happen, Julian. He said, oh, okay. And from that conversation, the three of us then went to Morehouse's campus and started organizing, getting people to come to Sale Hall for our first meeting. And then I contacted people at Clark, whom I had known. I had known Benjamin Brown's brother, Clarence, was one of my best friends at the YMCA years earlier, and I knew he was at Clark, so I called him. And I asked him to get the SGA people. Then I called Spelman. Bottom line is that we began to reach out. Well, before we could get anywhere, I got Miss Hill, who was the president's secretary, Dr. Mays' secretary. She came down to my office. You know, my office was at A.C. Milton hanging out down there when I wasn't in class. So she came in there and she did this. Now let me tell you, when Mrs. Hill did this, you knew Dr. Mays wanted you for something. Now, I didn't know Mays really knew who I was, although I introduced him when I was a child. I still did not know that he knew who I was. So I went up there to the third floor of Harkness Hall, to the Council of Presidents conference room. I was supposed to be there, I think, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And lo and behold, when I get up there, hear all the folks that I've been trying to pull together, along with the heads of the SGA and the 6 college presidents. Oh, Jesus. I knew what I was there for. I learned firsthand then that the college presidents had their ears to the ground as to what was happening on these campuses. Dr. Clement began, because he was the chairman, to tell us we had to go back to class, basically, and let the NAACP handle these matters in the courts. Dr. Mays reiterated that same position. He mentioned that he was the life membership chairman for the NAACP, so forth and so on. But they got to the man from Spelman, Dr. Manley, he pretty much said the same thing. They got to Dr. Brawley from Clark, who made an outrageous comment when he said, if we go downtown to demonstrate, it would embarrass him. I will never forget that. And so we went on. Then they got to Dr. Harry V. Richardson, the president of ITC. Dr. Richardson was called upon to speak, and he paused, as preachers do, for about 10 seconds. And when he spoke, he said, I believe the students are right. Wow. That shocked everybody in the room, including the 4 other college presidents. And he went on to give a speech on why he thought the time had come. And he was standing up with us. What that meant was that the college presidents, 6 of them, that was a break in the ranks, you follow me, in front of the students. But before they could get their bearing, Dr. Frank Cunningham from Morris Brown was next. And he came in and knocked the ball out the park. He said, I agree with Dr. Richardson. Wow. These students are right. And when those 2 men at the end of the presentations sided with us, we knew then that we had them in a box, you know. So Clement, brilliant man, he said, if you're going to do this, you ought to write a manifesto as to why you're doing it. Mm. He said, this is the AU Center. This is the citadel of black higher education in private colleges in the world. So there needs to be a lasting document if you're going to do this. So we agreed that we would do that. Now what he had in mind, I believe, although he never said it, was that if he can get us to put our energies in writing a document, we might not do the rest of the stuff. You follow me?
Yes, sir.
And he said, I'll raise the money because, he said, I'll raise $12,000 to pay for the ad. We're going to run this ad in all the major newspapers. So Clement raised $12,000. The ad cost us $4,000. But I then appointed Rosalind Pope, who was the president of Spelman's SGA, who was a brilliant English major. I said, write the appeal for us. And I appointed Julian and Marsh Dillard and Albert Benson to help her, but she basically wrote it. At the same time, though, I'm telling the rest of our team, we're going to organize, and we're going to sit in within a week after we publish the appeal. And so the appeal was published on the 9th of March, 1960. And on the 15th of March, we began our demonstrations simultaneously at 11:30 all over town. Shocked this town because everybody thought that we were too intelligent to be out here acting like folks at A&T and other places. In other words, the folks at AU Center, we are just too intelligent. We're not going to do that. You know, that's for the less than.
Right.
That's for the state-supported schools. You follow me?
Yes, sir. And Mr. King, thank you for that, and for putting it into a perspective in the way that you did, and to know that the college presidents, you know, were divided, and that some did stand boldly, I guess, to their peers for you. And you said that y'all did start to protest pretty immediately, and before one of those big protests, we know that you called Dr. King to come and join to come and join the movement. So can you talk about the Riches Department Store protest and the role that Dr. King played in that?
Well, there's a lot that happened before then, but maybe we can talk about that some other time, and maybe you can put it in. But let me try to answer your question specifically. We had to run a protest movement with two tiers. By that I mean we had to have some shock troops, 10 or 15 of them, who could keep the movement going and in the newspapers. But then we had to have grand marches or demonstrations where we could get the thousands to join, because the bulk of the students kept going to class on a regular basis. But there were some of us who gave up our education at that time in order to go on and do this. Over the summer of 1960, we began, the students, a boycott on downtown. And we chose Rich's Department Store as the focal point. Rich's Department Store was the kingpin. It was the major piece in the domino. We felt that if we break the Rich's Department Store, the rest of the town merchants will fall, like dominoes. I called Martin King in around August of 1960 and told him that we were going to we stage a massive, massive protest as soon as the students get back, to put this idea of the inhumanity of what whites were doing to us on the front pages of the world, and that we need you to go to jail with us, okay? I said, now we're going to send telegrams to Nixon and to Kennedy, because if you did not know that all these cities were on fire about this stuff, you know, if you looked at the presidential debates, you would never know it, because there's not one thing that has been said about racism or about segregation or desegregation. It's all about foreign policy, domestic policy, but nothing about race relations. And the place was burning. So King agreed to do that. So on October the 18th, I was speaking to students out there at Spelman, I guess it was. And I asked Herschel Chalanoa Sullivan then to go call him and tell him to meet me on the bridge, Martin, on the bridge the next morning at 10 o'clock. She went to call him, and she came back and she said, he said he's not going to be able to go. I said, he's not going to be able to go? She says, no. I said, Herschel, talk to the students and let me go talk to him. So I called him back, and on the phone was Y.T. Walker, his brother, all these folks on a party line. But I want to talk to him because he's the one who made a commitment to me. And so he gave me all the arguments about him having taken Lillian Smith to the airport, got arrested in DeKalb County, and got probation and all this kind of stuff. And if he goes to jail, they're going to probably revoke his probation. And I think that was a legitimate thing, to be honest with you, because they were going to do that. So after I listened to his argument, I said, ML, I was LC and he was ML since 45 when I joined that church. I said, you're our leader. And I said something else that I knew was going to hit his daddy hard. I said, you can't lead from the back. You got to lead from the front. And we need to have you down here with me tomorrow. And can I get that commitment? He said, LC, where do you want me to meet you? I said, 10 o'clock on the bridge. And we were there at 10 o'clock on the bridge. And the rest is history. You know, we got arrested, and it went all over the world, and it changed the presidential election, except in Atlanta. The black folks in Atlanta still on the plantation. They voted for Nixon. But yes, they did. But all the rest of America's black folks voted for John Kennedy. I can't explain to you except that at a later time I can talk to you about the battle that we had. The battles in Atlanta that we had were not just with the white segregationists. We had to battle the white segregationists and the Negro Toms, who believed since 1906 that somehow or another they were at the table, and that therefore this unequal alliance between North Side whites and West Side blacks was going to decide the pace of freedom for black folks in this town. And they were prepared for a century of segregation. And they were shocked when the thousands of us over here said, no, we're not going to wait a century. We want it now.
What spurred the persistence of the student movement, and what inspired y'all to stand up to the old guard leadership that had done a really good job with Atlanta for a long time? Atlanta had really bulwark and stalwart and just great figures and great black figures. How did y'all stand up to them, and what spurred and motivated that?
Well, I think the thing that really helped us a great deal was the fact that some of your border states were beginning to give in. You found that Greensboro caved in. Places in Maryland caved in. Kentucky, some places in Kentucky agreed to desegregate. So you could begin to see around the South that the walls of segregation were beginning to crumble. There's nothing like success to fuel an insurgent movement. Now, I think if the whites had held the line and just would not give 1 inch, it would have been, we still would have gotten it, but it would have taken a whole lot more effort.
Right.
But the biggest problem that we faced in Atlanta was really not the white folks, but it was the black folks who called themselves leaders.
Well, just to switch gears for a bit, we know that one of the main points of the civil rights movement was the nonviolent strategy that came from Dr. King. How did the students view that strategy, and did that view of nonviolence change during the course of the student movement?
Let me try to put that in perspective. First of all, the idea of nonviolence in the movement really started with the Nashville group under James Lawson. When Martin got involved, and Martin broadened it to include his having adopted the nonviolent philosophy from Mahatma Gandhi and his involvement with Dr. Mays and so forth and so on. But I got to be historically accurate. It was Jim Lawson in '59 who started going through all this stuff. The students were of two schools here when it came to nonviolence. One school of thought was, we'll use nonviolence as a political tactic. We're not going to really be nonviolent, except that we're going to use it as a tactic to achieve a certain goal. And the idea was to be nonviolent, to arouse the dozing conscience of folks, if they had a conscience, about the inhumanity of segregation and discrimination. The other school of thought that was with the students was one wherein they adopted nonviolence as a way of life. And I was of the mind of doing it as a tactic, not as a way of life, because I just was never taught that if anyone run over you, I mean, you got to deal with it, unless you have a much higher purpose. And the higher purpose happened to have been to use it as a tactic. And I would dare say that most of the students use it as a tactic as opposed to a philosophy and a way of life.
So then with that response, it makes sense that when Stokely Carmichael comes along later, that I guess with the black power that so many students are willing and ready to adapt that tactic?
Well, I'm one of those persons who believe that to polarize issues around black power may not have been the best thing. I'm not sure that we gained anything other than a psychological thrill for hollering black power. Because what that basically did was that a lot of people of goodwill who don't look like us left the movement. And when they left the movement, they took their foundation money and other stuff that was helping us fuel this movement with them. Sometimes you don't use symbols that are going to go against the core project that you have in mind. And I wish Oakley had not done that, because if you go back and look at it historically, that's when the air started coming out of the balloon. Because what we found in the 1960s is that a lot of the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the abolitionist movement, which fought to free us from slavery, were in this movement with us. Wow. So I think that to argue black power at the time he did, probably, and I'm looking at this now in hindsight, which is 50-50, was probably a tactical mistake. That doesn't mean that we don't believe in black power and blacks ought to be in power, but I think that movements can be shaped by innuendo, can be shaped by propaganda. Let me just give you an example. Barack Obama and his policies are under attack by Western Europeans all over this country, and with half-truths, misstatements, you name it. I haven't seen a single pundit state what really is going on, which is that white Anglo-Saxon men cannot bring themselves, they don't have any brain cells of recognition that someone other than someone from Western Europe can be the head of the most powerful nation in the world. And before the man was inaugurated, they said, we're going to make sure he's a one-term president. We're going to take our country back. Take our country back from whom? You know, he's not American. What they really mean is that he's not white. That's what they really mean. So when you put all this stuff together, sometimes you have to watch these symbols. It's a political game. It is a game where people can be pushed one way or the other with these 24-hour right-wing TV shows.
Speaking of symbols and I guess strategies, one of the strategies that I think you created was the kneel-in and the pray-in. Can you talk about what the effect of kneeling in and praying in was, and just more about that idea?
Well, remember it's 1960,
right.
And what I'm trying to do is to keep the movement alive while I'm waiting for these thousands of students to come back. A lot of folks thought it was going to die over the summer, but I said, let's keep it alive. And so we started the boycotts, you name it. Close down your account with segregation, open up your account with freedom, all that kind of stuff was going on. But we also said, why don't we really prick the white folks where it really is going to hurt them? And that is, let's go to church on Sunday. Martin had made a speech, Martin King had made a speech where he said 11 o'clock is the most segregated hour of the week. And I agree with him on that. So what I did was I pulled together about 20-some students, and on August the 6th, 1960, we went to all these churches all over town, shocked them to their bones. I went to I guess it's Druid Hills Baptist Church there at the corner of Ponce de Leon and Highland. And when I got there, the usher stopped me at the door and said that I couldn't come in. This was a white church, so forth and so on. I thought this was a church where you could come and worship. But it's only white people. And so they blocked the door. And then they whispered, someone went to get someone else, I guess the head white man, to come talk to me. So I then decided to grab the pen and sign the guest list. Lonnie King was here, basically, okay? He came and grabbed the pen, and so we had this pen. You know, I had one part of it, he had one part. He didn't try to take it from me, I didn't try to take it. We just held the pen like it was a stalemate. So, eventually, I just gave him the pen because he didn't want me to sign, and I said, you know, forget it. What I had, though, was I had Douglas Kiker, a reporter from the Atlanta Journal, outside in the bushes. And so I had Doug to come out of the bushes with his camera and take pictures, and we pushed it all over America. If I could just let you understand that we tried to do more than just lunch counter sit-ins. We went to the movies, and we got in white people's way in the movies to break that down. We went to Grady Hospital to break that down because, you know, we had two kinds of healthcare venues here. And the idea of filing the lawsuit against the Parks and Recreation and the courtrooms and all that, the catalyst, I guess, came when we filled the jails in the early part of 1961, I guess around February it was. And we had come to court to appear, to see whether or not they're going to bound you over for prosecution. So when I got there that morning, you know, the tradition, let me just say parenthetically, the tradition in Atlanta at the time and throughout the South, but certainly in Atlanta was voluntary segregation. In other words, when you go to the Court of Justice, if a black person sat on the left-hand side, then all the folks who came in there would know that they had to sit on the left-hand side. If a white person sat on the left-hand side, then all the black folks would know you got to go on the right-hand side. It was in the minds. So we were out here protesting, and in comes about 30 or 40 of our students who had been arrested. So I got to court about 10 or 15 minutes after the court had started. And so when I went in, we had the blacks on the left side, whites on the right side. And so I said, this is ludicrous to come in here in a court of justice, and we've been fighting and we got arrested for trying to break down this stuff, and I'm going to go over here and sit on the segregated side. I'm not going to do it. And so I went over to the white side. So when I went to the white side, Gwen Middlebrooks from Spelman joined me, and so did other women from Spelman. So we sat over there with all the white people. Well, Judge Paul Webb, who was the judge at the time, he was presiding, he stopped the court. And he said, bailiff, go back there and get Lonnie King. Leave them gals alone. They're just following him. So they left them alone. He brought me up there, and he said, what do you think you're doing? I said, I'm sitting down, waiting for you to call my case. You know the laws of this city? I said, yeah, but they're unjust. He said, I'm going to put you in jail for contempt of court for as long as I can. Bailiff, take him to a cell. They took me down to the jail. We were at 193 Decatur Street at the time. They locked me up for 5 hours. That's the longest he said that he could keep me in jail. Well, when we filed the lawsuit, of course, I used that incident to show the discrimination, along with all the rest of the stuff too, but I'm just telling you the background behind that situation. And of course, when we won the suit, that ended all of this two-tiered kind of justice, you know, where you come in here and you voluntarily go and segregate yourself. You know, blacks on this side, whites on this side, or vice versa, depending upon who sat down first. But so the students tried to change everything while we were here.
And that included the churches, that included the courts, that included, you know, restaurants. And there's somewhere I read that over 300 establishments in Atlanta, y'all were able to change and to desegregate. Now, I know that that while the Atlanta University Center was obviously, you know, the most important academic environment that created this. What role did Emory students, did Georgia Tech, Agnes Scott, did the other college students, black and white from those places, play in the student movement?
Well, first of all, there were no black students at those schools, number one. Number two, the Emory University students, about 5 of them did get involved. A guy named Jim Aldrich, who was the president of the Emory University Student Government Association, he came and he brought with him about 4 or 5 other students. They were sympathetic. They did not take the risk that we took, but they did come over and talk with us and all those kind of things. But they were never actually on our protest. Agnes Scott also had students, a few girls who came over. There was nobody from Georgia Tech at all. None.
And what was the student? How did y'all feel about the relative lack of participation by the other students? Did you feel that?
You mean the white students?
Yes.
That didn't bother us at all. No, that did not bother us at all.
Could you talk a little bit more, I guess, about that relationship that you had with Dr. King? You said that you called him ML, so I'm assuming that y'all were pretty close. Can you talk about that relationship that you had with Dr. King and with Mrs. King, especially as she tried to get Dr. King's birthday to be a holiday and build the King Center here in Atlanta? So can you speak about that?
Well, let me first of all say that Dr. King and I were very good friends. The man was just a gifted orator. And what a lot of people don't understand is that Martin King practiced his craft. When he was a teenager, you could come to that church on a Thursday night and you could hear him upstairs in the pulpit preaching. You know, he practiced to the point that he knew his craft. He also was a person who had approximately 17 speeches that he learned verbatim. And so therefore, all he had to do was basically read the newspapers and piece together what he wanted to say out of those 17 speeches. He was always on stage, okay? So you don't see him using too many notes. That's because he had it in his head, and he could interchange those ideas. But all I can tell you is that a relationship was good. I'm still a member of that church since 1945. Now, his dad and I did not get along that well. We got along extremely well until 1960 when the movement started. But for some reason, he and I just never could quite get it together. I remember when we finally had to settle with the white merchants, it was Daddy King who got up and said, "I'm tired of you, boy. You're going to tear up this town. I baptized you." That was a heavy blow to come from someone that I had revered since I was 8 years of age. And it was particularly heavy when you consider that it was in the conference room at the Chamber of Commerce with all the power brokers from the black and the white community there. And I'm just 22 years old, 23 years old, and I think a part of what was going on here is that some of the old line leadership, Martin King's daddy included, I think really resented what the students had done, because I think they knew that they should have done something earlier, but they were afraid to do it. And now that's what I think happened. And you know, what is it? The New York Times had an editorial cartoon in 1960 which had Roy Wilkins and Lester Granger of the Urban League and about 4 or 5 civil rights leaders. And the caption of that particular cartoon was, well, no. They had these leaders following this group of students, and the caption was, "Wait for me, we're your leaders." That's a part of what was happening here in Atlanta, Georgia.
Wow. And one of the You mentioned, I guess that some of the old line leaders, we're kind of chasing y'all and saying up for you new students to wait for them. Talk a little bit about the formation of the Atlanta Inquirer, the newspaper that the students created, and what that meant for the old guard leadership of Atlanta.
Well, the Atlanta Daily World was run by Mr. C.A. Scott, who was a Republican, very conservative man. And he did the same thing that the white papers were doing in town. He stopped carrying the news about the lunch counter desegregations. See, the best way you can kill a movement is to minimize their communication so that people cannot get any encouragement from other folks who are being successful. You create a vacuum, you isolate people. And so we knew that we had to arouse the masses of folks in this town if we intended to win. We had to go beyond these leaders, because the leaders, they didn't really represent anybody but themselves. The folks who should have been represented were these $5 a day in coffee people. And when you create a movement that reaches the masses, those folks in between you and the masses, they get very upset, but you're going to move them eventually. And that's kind of what happened here. Scott would not cover the movement at all. He said we ought to go back to class. A man named Kasut Hill owned Hill Office Supplies, whose wife was Ginger Hill, who headed the School of Social Work at AU, called me one day and he said, it's a shame of what Scott's doing to the movement. And he says, it's also a shame that you all having to publish a newsletter. See, we had a publication that you may or may not have seen called The Student Movement in You. And we put out 20,000 of those every Sunday on people's cars around town, giving them notice about what was happening around the country and around the South. He said, I have a printing press at Hill Office Supply that we can use as an offset press. And I have an idea of a newspaper called the Atlanta Inquirer. He said, I have an editor too, Bill Strong, who went to Morehouse. He said, if you can get people to write for us, I will start that newspaper, because you need an organ in order to get this movement going. And so that's how I got started. Bill Strong first, and then Carl Holman came in to take Bill Strong's place. And what really got us over was when the head of the Empire Real Estate Board, Mr. Q.V. Williamson, real estate man, he and a man named Bill Calloway came to me and said, I think we're going to take the ads out of the Atlanta World and put them in this new paper. These are the real estate ads. And he said, and we believe that that'll bring Scott to his knees. Well, they were right. They took the ads out and put them in our new paper. Wow. Oh, man. But in addition to that, I had pushed the boycott of colonial stores. And we had basically closed up the colonial store on Edgewood Avenue and also on Ashby Street, which is now Joe Lowry. So the head of colonial stores for the South contacted Mr. Scott and told him that they were going to take his $9,000 ad out of the paper unless he convinces me to call off the movement. So Scott had me to come down there for the meeting, and he preached on me, he spat on me, he was so angry. And so when he finished, I said, Mr. Scott, you know what? In every movement that I've ever read about, there are always people who get hurt. I said, but you can't stop the movement if your cause is right, because somebody might get hurt. I said, this is your time, Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott lost a $9,000 ad, and he went to his grave hating me. But suppose I had agreed with Mr. Scott and called off the movement. It might have still happened, but it would have been slowed down some. There comes a time when you have to make a decision, even though it might hurt somebody personally, to make a decision based on what the whole needs, okay? The Inquirer was an idea that we help bear fruit It's one of the lasting legacies of the movement. 50 years later, the paper is still here. And we have to thank that publisher down there, John Smith, and others who got all involved, Jesse Hill and company, to try to keep it going. But there are a few things around that we can still point to and say, were it not for the students, that would not be going on.
Oh, well then, my last question to you is that the students of the 1960s did have some tough decisions to make, and we look back and we read and we get to sit here and talk with you about your experiences and you know how you guys were motivated to fight for causes. I mean, really fight for human rights and appeal for human rights. What do you think then are the causes that our generation need to be fighting for and need to learn from the example that y'all set for us?
I think the major thing you have to understand is that our overall community has been asleep for at least 50 years, or maybe 45 years. We are very trusting and believing people. And we really believe in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and all those kind of things. But we're the only group that really believes in that like we do. There are other folks who believe just the opposite, that there are two tiers of justice and freedom in this country, one for Western Europeans and one for the rest of us. What has happened is that we have not, from an intellectual point of view, on the college campuses and some other places, kept a consistent eye on our progress in this country. And what I mean by that is this. In 1960, 90% of our population were blue-collar people and below, maybe 95%. The average wage was about $5 a day in car fare for that 90-some%. Looking at the data today, we see roughly about 90% of our population is still behind and getting further behind. So what has happened is that we've been suffering something that people used to call the delusion of inclusion. And because we haven't seen the visible signs of segregation that we fought 50 years ago, people thought everything was okay. What has happened is that the enemies of us, who were the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of our enemies from before, politically have raped us. And they have gone from being Dixiecrats and racists to being Republicans and still racist. And they have formed an electoral majority that you just saw demonstrated its power on this past Tuesday. The unfulfilled dream of our revolution is the issue of education of our young people. If we don't find a way, you folks on this campus, to join other folks on other campuses, to form a critical mass to deal with the education of our children, we are talking about a group that is going to be in prison, most of the men, in the next 30 years. It's a very, very serious crisis out here, and nobody wants to deal with it. The other thing we have to deal with is the fact that it doesn't matter whether your oppressor is white or black. If your children are being miseducated, you got to call time out. Because if they've come to get you, it doesn't matter what their color happens to be. What happens is that you are going to be obliterated. And I'll conclude this part of it by telling you that in 1865, an ex-slave in Louisville, Kentucky, is reported to have said that freedom without education is not freedom at all. Our people need educating. And it's not about money, because the money is there. It's about commitment. It's about trying to find people who have the audacity and the will and the motivation that those older teachers who taught us. Let me tell you, my teachers in high school, taught me how to hand-me-down books. They taught me out of books that had Boys High and all the white school names in them. Some of the books had the pages torn out. But those teachers who saw that took into account that we've got to educate these children whether we get good books or not. And they took other things. We don't have that kind of commitment today. And somehow or another, we don't see ourselves as our brother's keeper, as our children's keeper. When I was going to high school, I would pass by racketeers on Auburn Avenue. And you know what they would say? You stay in school now. Don't you cut class and come down here. We don't do that anymore. Everybody in 50 years ago was trying to uplift the race. Piecemeal, of course, with these Uncle Toms, yes, but they were still trying. We don't find that many people now who look like us who are trying to do that. The irony of what I see going on in America is that most of the people who are on the cutting edge of trying to educate the inner city kids, most of whom are black, are white people. Are white people. And whereas I applaud them for what they want to do on that score, my question is, where are the black people? Where are the people who can follow into the footsteps of a Benjamin Mays or an E.B. Williams or a James Weldon Johnson? Some of those people who could have done other things, but who took the time to try and inculcate in me and thousands of other people this desire to want to do something to help the descendants of Africa. And until we could begin to do that, we're going to always be drawers of water and hewers of wood.
Well, Mr. King, thank you for your time today, and thank you for your insight on the movement and your insight on really the issues that we're still grappling with today. We appreciate you taking the time to do this, and we hope to get the chance to do more of this and do this again.
Well, it's up to Dr. Crawford, but I'll be happy to come back.